Welcome to Ancient Echoes podcast. My name is Jericho Canning. Hope you're having a good day. Today we're going to continue on with the Pauline versus Christ podcast. This will be part 3. So let me ask you a question that sounds outrageous at first, but it gets harder to ignore the longer you sit with it. If you remove Apostle Paul from the New Testament, do you still have Christianity? Not church culture, not Christmas athletics, not crosses on buildings. I mean Christianity as a system. A belief structure, a salvation framework, a religion that can scale, organize, and govern people. Because once you strip away assumptions and actually read the text, you start noticing something unsettling. Christianity, as we know it today, doesn't primarily run on Jesus. How scary does that sound? It does not run on Jesus. In fact, most evangelical Christians don't even like the Jesus message in the Gospels. They love the Apostle Paul message. The Republican Party, they love Apostle Paul. So do we really have Christianity, or do we have Paulinism? A Paulinity, right? Think about that. Why this question matters. Most Christians would immediately say, of course Christianity survives without Paul, right? It's about Jesus, right? That's what we hear a lot. Focus on Jesus. I heard that throughout my walk when I was a Christian for years. Focus on Jesus, King Jesus. It's all about Jesus. You just need Jesus to change your life. Jesus would do this, Jesus would do that, right? But that answer usually comes from emotion, not structure. See, let's be precise. Jesus gives teaching, parables, ethical demands, critiques of power, a vision of God's kingdom. Paul gives doctrine, explanations of salvation, frameworks for belief, justification theory, a portable religion for the Gentiles. See, Apostle Paul speaks to the Gentiles when he speaks, and Jesus speaks to the Jews when he speaks. So those are not the same thing. And when he asks which one churches actually use to function, the answer becomes uncomfortable. So what Jesus actually teaches, and let's just start with Jesus on his own terms. Jesus constantly talks about the kingdom of heaven, justice, mercy, wealth, poverty. Oftentimes he's quoted saying you can't love money and you can't love him. You have to choose one. And he even talks about how it's hard for a rich man to reach heaven. He told one rich man to sell all of his things and come follow him. And there's a couple of verses just like that. Jesus talks about hypocrisy, power, behavior, transformation. Jesus says things like, love your enemies, forgive endlessly, sell what you have, care for the poor, take care of the sick, go visit a prisoner, right? Go help the poor, needy, and come follow me. What Jesus does not do, lay out a theory of atonement, explain how his death saves the world, define justification by faith, outline belief requirements, create creeds. Jesus teaches a way of life. It's not a belief system that matters. Now, what Apostle Paul introduces, that's something totally different. Majority of evangelical Christians won't even notice this. Now, enter Paul. Paul does something revolutionary. He takes Jesus, right? and he turns him into a theological solution. Paul introduces justification by faith, salvation apart from works of the law, being in Christ, righteousness credited, not practiced, cosmic salvation language, belief-centered identity. Paul answers questions Jesus never applicably addresses. Like, how does the cross work? What saves a person? How do Gentiles belong? What replaces the Torah? What does belief accomplish? See, without Paul, those questions remain open. With Paul, they got systemized. Now I ask you this, what happens if we remove Paul from the New Testament? Do we still have Christianity? Let's be honest. If we remove Paul, we lose justification by faith as doctrine, not under the law, but under grace, salvation defined primarily by belief, the idea that Jesus' death mechanically saves, the theological engine of most sermons, and the framework that makes Christianity portable. What you're left with is not modern Christianity. You're left with a Jewish reform movement centered on ethics, justice, and community transformation. That's closer to Jesus, right? And by the way, I said this earlier, Jesus never did away with the law. He fulfilled it. So technically, we should be following the 613 commands in the Old Testament if we want to be truthful, right? You know, that's what evangelical Christians should be doing, right? And bring back, follow the Sabbath day, right? Honor it. Now, why couldn't the church survive on Jesus alone? Think about that. This is the uncomfortable truth. Jesus is difficult. Jesus resists hierarchy. The church is all about hierarchy, all about politics, all about the Republican Party, power, money, control. Jesus threatens wealth. The American Evangelical Church is all about wealth, money, and the Republican Party. Jesus undermines religious authority. Jesus refuses to give simple answers. Jesus centers behavior over belief. Jesus doesn't scale well. You can't easily build an empire on love your enemies, can you? And give your money away, can you? Paul, however, gives the church tools, clear identity markers, belief boundaries, insider versus outsider categories, theological certainty, and a salvation formula. That's not an insult, it's an observation. Once Christianity moves beyond Judaism, Paul becomes indispensable. Gentiles aren't going to keep kosher, observe Sabbath, follow Torah laws, live like the Jews, just like Americans ain't going to do that. Paul solves our problem. He reframes Jesus so the Torah is no longer central. Belief replaces practice. Faith replaces covenant law. Without Paul, Christianity remains a Jewish sect. With Paul, it becomes a global religion. That's the pivot point. How does this play out today? Well, let's pay attention to Sunday sermons. How often do you hear Romans, Galatians, Ephesians? Now compare that to how often you hear Jesus, hardest teachings, taken seriously. Taken seriously. Jesus becomes a symbol. Paul becomes Emmanuel. Jesus provides the brain. Paul provides the operating systems, which what we have today. That's why Christianity can survive, even when churches ignore most of what Jesus actually taught. This is true. So, does this mean that Paul is bad? No, this isn't about violence. Paul was responding to real problems: inclusion, identity, community boundaries, cultural expan- expansion. But acknowledging Paul's role means admitting Christianity's constructed, not dropped from heaven, fully formed. It evolved, adopted, it chose what worked. And it's cultural, and it changes within its culture, and it adapts to survive. It's like a virus. Christianity is always adapting, always changing, always finding what fits within its culture. So, do we still have Christianity without Paul? Here's the honest answer: you don't have institutional Christianity without Paul. You don't have modern salvation theology, belief based membership, creeds, empire compatibility. But you do still have Jesus, ethics, kingdom language, radical compassion, critiques of power, a dangerous moral vision. The question: are those enough? Historically, institutions answered no. But the real question is, and it isn't, was Paul right or wrong? It's this: why did Christianity choose Paul's framework over Jesus? Think about that. And what did it gain and lose by doing so? Because once you see that choice, you understand why Christianity looks the way it does today, and why so many people read Jesus and feel like they're reading someone the church barely knows. So we're going to wrap it up with this. If you ever wondered why Jesus feels sidelines, why belief matters more than behavior, why Christianity feels nothing like the Gospels, now you know. Remove Paul, Apostle Paul, and Christianity doesn't disappear. It becomes something very different. Something harder, something smaller, something less controllable. And that may be exactly why Paul became indispensable. Well, this is the Ancient Echoes podcast. My name is Jared Buchanan. If you like my work, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please click like on this post and keep updated weekly. And thank you for listening to part 3. And